Episode 19, Latin America in the 19th Century. Question 1. What were the four external factors that inspired the Latin American independence movements of the early 19th century? Why was each so influential? The Latin American independence movements of the early 19th century were profoundly shaped by four key external influences: the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and the political turmoil on the Iberian Peninsula after the Napoleonic Wars. Each provided both ideological inspiration and practical opportunity for colonial elites seeking autonomy. Lasting from 1775 to 1781, the American Revolution demonstrated that European colonies could successfully challenge imperial authority. The victory of the 13 colonies over the British offered a model of republicanism and self-government, proving that Enlightenment ideals such as liberty and popular sovereignty could be realized in the New World. Latin American Creoles, often wealthy and educated but excluded from political power, saw in this precedent a justification for their own independence. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, added a deeper ideological current, spreading the principles of equality, citizenship, and the rights of man across the Atlantic world. Though many Latin American elites feared its radicalism, its rhetoric undermined the legitimacy of monarchy and divine right, inspiring reformist and revolutionary movements alike. The Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, had a different but equally powerful effect. It was the first successful slave uprising in history, and resulted in the establishment of an independent black republic. While elites in Spanish America viewed it with anxiety, fearing similar uprisings, it proved that liberation from European domination was possible for all classes and races, energizing marginalized groups and radical reformers. Finally, the collapse of royal authority in Spain and Portugal after Napoleon's invasion of 1807 to 1808 created a power vacuum that afforded colonial leaders an opportunity for action. With legitimate monarchs deposed or exiled, Creole elites claimed the right to govern in their own stead, transforming temporary self-rule into permanent independence. Together, these influences provided the ideals, the example, and the opportunity for Latin America's revolutionary age. Question 2. How does the example of Miguel de Hidalgo and Agustin de Iturbide illustrate the class tensions that would persist even after the wars of independence were over? The contrasting figures of Miguel de Hidalgo and Agustin de Iturbide highlight the deep class divisions that both fueled and outlasted Latin America's wars of independence. Hidalgo, a Creole priest and intellectual influenced by Enlightenment ideals, initiated Mexico's independence movement in 1810 by appealing to indigenous peasants and mestizos. His call for social reform, including land reform and an end to racial inequality, quickly transformed what began as a political revolt into a social revolution. To the wealthy Creole elite, Hidalgo's movement appeared dangerously radical, threatening not only Spanish authority but also their own social and economic dominance. His execution in 1811 symbolized elite fear of popular upheaval. A decade later, Agustin de Iturbide, a Creole military officer, led a very different revolution. Initially a loyalist who fought against Hidalgo's insurgents, Iturbide eventually allied with liberal forces once Spain's monarchy weakened. His 1821 Plan of Iguala united Creoles and Peninsulares under the banner of independence, but preserved Catholic orthodoxy, private property, and the existing social hierarchy. Independence under Iturbide meant political sovereignty without social equality. Together, Hidalgo and Iturbide embody the dual nature of Latin American independence, a mass yearning for justice and a conservative elite's drive for control. After independence, Creole elites replaced Peninsular Spaniards but maintained the same systems of privilege and exclusion. The tension between revolutionary ideals and entrenched inequality would continue to shape Latin American politics for generations. In short, Hidalgo dreamed of justice, but Iturbide ensured continuity, and that contradiction defined the new nations. Question 3. The ideals of the Latin American independence movements were egalitarian, but once independence had been achieved, what class tensions arose? Although the Latin American independence movements were inspired by Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty, the reality that followed independence was far less egalitarian. The wars of liberation had energized a broad social base: Creoles, mestizos, indigenous peoples, free blacks, and enslaved Africans, who hoped political freedom from Europe would bring opportunity and social justice. Instead, independence largely benefited the Creole elite, who replaced the peninsular Spaniards at the top of society, but preserved the colonial social hierarchy. The Creoles, wealthy landowners of European descent born in the Americas, had led many of the revolutionary movements, but their goals were political, not social. They sought to end imperial restrictions on trade and governance while maintaining control over land, labor, and indigenous populations. When independence was achieved, these elites assumed leadership positions in the new republics, crafting constitutions that protected property and privilege rather than redistributing wealth or power. Meanwhile, mestizos, indigenous peoples, and former slaves who had fought and died in the wars of independence found themselves excluded from meaningful participation. In some cases, land confiscated from loyalists was simply reabsorbed by Creole landlords. Persistent inequality fueled frequent peasant uprisings and regional revolts, highlighting the gap between revolutionary rhetoric and post war reality. Independence replaced foreign domination with domestic oligarchy. The dream of equality gave way to a system in which class divisions hardened, and Latin America's social structure remains strikingly similar to that of the colonial era. The revolutions freed nations, not people. Question 4. How does the rise of caudillos illustrate the challenges in maintaining the new republics? The emergence of caudillos, charismatic military strongmen who dominated Latin American politics for decades following independence, illustrates the profound difficulty the new republics faced in establishing stable constitutional governments. The wars of independence had left much of the region economically devastated, politically fragmented, and socially divided. In this environment, traditional institutions like legislatures, courts, and civilian administrations were weak or non existent, while military leaders who had rose to prominence during the wars retained both weapons and prestige. These caudillos, men like Juan Manuel de Rosas in Argentina or Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna in Mexico, filled the power vacuum by presenting themselves as protectors of order and national unity. They often appealed to local loyalties, patronage networks, and populist rhetoric rather than to abstract ideas of constitutionalism. Their authority usually derived from a combination of personal charisma and military strength, not constitutional legitimacy. While some caudillos brought temporary stability, most ruled authoritarianly, favoring loyal elites and suppressing dissent. Their dominance reflected the deeper structural challenges of the new republics: weak economies, limited literacy, entrenched social inequality, and the absence of a shared political culture. Ultimately, the rise of caudillos exposed a central paradox of independence: the liberation of nations without the creation of strong democratic institutions. The promise of republican liberty gave way to cycles of militarism, regionalism, and personal rule, as fragile states struggled to balance freedom with order. The caudillo embodied both the revolution's hero and its undoing, a symbol of freedom turned ruler by necessity. Question 5. How did the economic relationship between Latin America and especially Britain establish a long-term pattern? After independence in the early 19th century, Latin America's economic relationship with Britain established a pattern of export dependence and foreign dominance that would shape the region for generations. With Spain and Portugal weakened and cut off by war, Britain emerged as Latin America's primary trading partner and source of investment, quickly filling the vacuum left by the colonial powers. Britain's industrial strength made it the quote unquote workshop of the world, producing manufactured goods far more efficiently and inexpensively than the newly independent Latin American republics. In return, Latin America exported raw materials and agricultural products such as silver, copper, guano, coffee, and sugar. This division of labor, industrial Europe producing finished goods and agrarian Latin America supplying raw materials, mirrored global economic trends, but left Latin America locked into a subordinate position within the world economy. British merchants and investors financed railways, mines, and ports across the region, facilitating export growth but also deepening dependency. Profits often flowed back to London rather than remaining in local economies, and local elites eager for access to European markets and luxury goods reinforced this structure by favoring free trade policies that discouraged industrial development. Although the relationship brought infrastructure and short term prosperity to some sectors, it entrenched an economic monoculture vulnerable to global price shifts. The lack of domestic manufacturing meant that Latin America remained dependent on imported goods and foreign credit. Britain replaced Spain not by conquest but through commerce, binding Latin America to the global economy as a supplier, not an equal partner. Question 6. Why would the peasantry ally with the landowners in opposition to liberal reformers? In the decades after Latin American independence, many peasants allied with conservative landowners in opposition to liberal reformers, a paradox that reveals the persistence of traditional hierarchies and local loyalties. Liberal reformers often sought to modernize society by breaking up communal lands, secularizing church property, and imposing new legal systems based on individual property rights. While these reforms were meant to encourage equality and productivity, to rural peasants they threatened customary protections and stability. For generations, peasants had depended on patron client relationship with landowners and the church for access to land, credit, and security. In return, they provided labor, deference, and military support. The liberal vision of private property and free labor disrupted this arrangement, exposing peasants to the risk of land loss, taxation, and market exploitation. Conservatives, especially landowners and clergy, promised continuity, paternal care, and defense of religious traditions, values that resonated more strongly with rural populations than abstract liberal ideals. Thus, peasants' alliances with conservative elites were pragmatic rather than ideological. It reflected an effort to preserve familiar systems of protection and identity within a rapidly changing world. Ironically, by opposing liberal reform, peasants often helped entrench the very social hierarchies that kept them subordinate, illustrating how modernization efforts in post independence Latin America repeatedly foundered on the deep social bonds of the colonial past. In resisting change, peasants defended security, and in doing so, preserved inequality. Question 7. How did liberalism become associated with nationalism in Mexico? What did Benito Juárez and Maximilian von Habsburg have to do with this? Why was this liberalism not accompanied by democracy? In 19th century Mexico, liberalism and nationalism become closely intertwined through the country's prolonged struggle to define itself after independence. Liberal reformers believed that Mexico's strength and sovereignty depended on breaking the liberal power of colonial institutions, the Catholic Church, the military, and the landed elite, and replacing them with a modern, secular, and centralized state. For them, liberalism was not merely an ideology of individual rights, but a program of national regeneration, essential to building a unified, independent Mexico free from foreign and clerical domination. Benito Juárez, a Zapotec lawyer and Mexico's first indigenous president, embodied this fusion of liberalism and nationalism. His reform laws of 1855 to 1863 abolished church privileges, nationalized ecclesiastical property, and established civil marriage and secular education. Juarez viewed these reforms as essential to national sovereignty and modernization, believing that only a rational, secular state could forge a truly Mexican identity. However, these liberal reforms provoked fierce resistance from conservatives, who saw them as an assault on religion, tradition, and social order. The internal conflict invited foreign intervention. In 1864, the French installed Maximilian von Habsburg as Emperor of Mexico, framing his rule as a quote unquote civilizing mission that combined European monarchism with conservative Catholic values. For Juarez and his supporters, Maximilian's reign symbolized foreign tyranny and the betrayal of Mexican independence, further binding liberalism to nationalism. Yet, despite its nationalistic aims, Mexican liberalism did not produce democracy. Liberal leaders, including Juarez himself, often governed autocratically, prioritizing stability, centralization, and modernization over broad political participation. A deeply divided society, limited literacy, and weak institutions made mass democracy impractical. In short, Mexican liberalism was nationalist in purpose, but elitist in practice, revolutionary against old hierarchies, yet reluctant to trust the people it professed to liberate. Question 8. How did the economic structure of the new republic perpetuate colonial social hierarchies? After independence, Latin America's economic systems changed far less than its political boundaries. The new republics inherited and perpetuated the colonial model of land concentration, import dependence, and social stratification, ensuring that the same elites who had dominated under the Spanish and Portuguese remained in control. The hacienda system, large estates worked by landless peasants, tenants, or indebted laborers, continued to define rural life. Independence did little to redistribute land or wealth. Creole elites simply replaced peninsular Spaniards as landowners. Most indigenous peoples and freed slaves remained trapped in semi feudal conditions, bound by debt, custom, or lack of alternatives. In cities, artisans and small traders faced stiff competition from imported European goods, which limited the growth of a native middle class. Economically, the new nations embraced export oriented trade, supplying raw materials such as sugar, coffee, silver, and hides to industrial Europe, while importing manufactured goods. This arrangement favored wealthy landowners and merchants, but left the masses vulnerable to price fluctuations and foreign control. British capital and technology modernized ports and railways, yet profits flowed abroad or to local elites, not to workers or rural producers. Thus, despite rhetoric of equality and liberty, independence entrenched a neo colonial order. Economic modernization advanced without social reform, and old hierarchies adapted to new circumstances. Political sovereignty masked economic dependency, a pattern that would shape Latin America's inequalities well into the modern era. Question 9. How did the evolution of the Mexican economy in the second half of the 19th century provoke a revolution? The Mexican Revolution of 1910 was rooted in the profound economic transformations that unfolded in the second half of the 19th century, particularly under the long rule of Porfirio Diaz, 1876 to 1911. Although this period, known as the Porfiriato, brought modernization and economic growth, it also deepened inequality and social dislocation, laying the groundwork for revolution. Diaz's regime pursued rapid industrialization and export oriented development, fueled by foreign, mainly US and British, investment. Railways, mining, and commercial agriculture expanded dramatically, integrating Mexico into the globalist capital economy. However, This growth overwhelmingly favored foreign corporations and domestic elites, not the Mexican majority. The drive for economic modernization required massive land consolidation. The government privatized communal lands, displacing millions of peasants and indigenous villagers. By 1910, roughly 1% of landowners controlled nearly all arable land, while most rural Mexicans became landless laborers or indebted peons on vast haciendas. Industrial workers, too, faced exploitative wages and harsh conditions in the new mines and factories, with no political channels to voice grievances. At the same time, Diaz maintained political stability through repression, silencing opposition, controlling elections, and limiting press freedoms. The result was the illusion of progress, masking deep social and regional inequalities. When economic downturns and rural displacement coincided with Diaz's aging dictatorship, discontent boiled over. Peasants, workers, and the emerging middle class united under leaders like Francisco Madero, Emiliano Zapata, and Pancho Villa, demanding political reform and social justice. Thus, Mexico's late 19th century economic miracle became its undoing, modernization without equity.